To my dearest friends, I am honored to welcome you back once more to the climactic and final part of our tale on the rise and fall of the Imperial Knights. Most everyone is already familiar with the concept of the Knights, with them being truly gargantuan walkers, piloted by a devout noble who will stride into battle as a titanic effigy to humanity's resilience against the horrors of the dark. The actual pilots themselves will often be drawn from truly ancient bloodlines, where their earliest ancestors stood to safeguard the colonial forces of mankind as they pushed out through the galactic frontier during the glorious and terrible Dark Age of technology. As a brief synopsis of our last sermon, we covered this Dark Age, where we followed the exploratory fleets of humanity and explored as to why the Knights were utterly necessary for our species to gain its foothold in the darkness of the void. But alas, with the devastation brought about from the Age of Strife, the early settlements and colonial worlds were cut off and isolated from one another, leading to a prolonged period of regression, wherein which some planets devolved into what we now know of as feudal worlds. Upon such planets, the individuals who piloted the Knights were to be vaunted as the kings, queens, and nobles who had a moral right to stand above the lowly peasants who would now serve them to any capacity they so desired. Unfortunately, these societies were rife with hatred and fear for the nightmares of the dark, and so most technological artifacts, save for the Knights themselves, were sadly to be destroyed. From their ashes, however, the settlers built up a new agrarian life for their kin, though over the long years they had since become incredibly insular, with all outsiders or suspicious individuals being violently removed from their society, always at the behest of the noble knights above. Though fraught with terror, there was an undeniable benefit to their new system of living, which most others within the galaxy could not contend with. Thanks to their fears, and thanks to their guardianship from the knightly households, the feudal worlds were able to withstand the long night of the Age of Strife, meaning that by the time we reached the 30th millennium, that these planets were left in a rather pristine state, which all would soon desire to claim. But in any case, from this point, we shall move on to telling the tale of how the Knights were integrated into the young Imperium, and of their fateful involvement within the cataclysmic civil war of the Horus Heresy. And so, my dearest friends, I invite you to sit back and relax as we follow on with this story of the rise and fall of the Imperial Knights. It was during the latter years of the 30th millennium that the Emperor of mankind emerged within the ravaged wastes of Old Terra to unite the warring techno-barbarian tribes under a single banner and to set out into the cosmos to bring all of mankind under a new empire, which he would name as his Imperium. For this goal, he was to be accompanied by his 20 genetically enhanced sons, known as the Primarchs, who had been birthed from a combination of his own DNA and of the dark forces of the warp. Each of the demigods would hold command over their own legion of space marines, who themselves were bio-engineered soldiers, and on their warpath they would carve out the great expanse of the void, so that all of mankind could rest easy under his watchful gaze. Their plan was simple. The army would set out on a Great Crusade to restore contact with the lost colonies and settlements of mankind, who would then be integrated into the burgeoning Imperium either by choice or by force. Meanwhile, the various threats of the alien, the mutant, and the heretic would be purged from the stars, purifying and sanctifying the expanse, which would soon act as the stage for humanity's ascension into the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known. Thus, as the winds of change billowed out across the void, it would be inevitable for them to eventually blow through the tranquil fields of the nightly worlds. These planets, as we discussed, were entirely self-sufficient, not even remaining in contact with one another, as the fires of war had taught them well to fear the outsider in any form. Yet there was no denying that the ceaseless passages of time had ravaged the nights in their own way, and so, when the first explorers of this era landed upon their worlds, they were not immediately rejected, nor killed for their intrusion. It was upon the planet of Crisis where the newborn Imperium first discovered the presence of the nightly worlds, though at this point the two parties did not establish any form of communication. A man by the name of Jeffers had been contracted to serve as a rogue trader, where he would set out in a void ship to explore the cosmos, searching for potential targets or points of interest, all to be relayed back to the larger crusading fleet. But when he passed down below the upper atmosphere of Crisis, he did not find desolation, and instead, there was clearly a human society shrouded beneath the clouds. The buildings, however, were crude, being built of mud and stone, sided by wooden forts and palisades, guarding over sprawling regions of farmland, which he spied humans on horseback, performing labours which to him seemed unnecessarily arduous. But despite their squalor, his eye was caught by the sight of a towering machine, languishing in rust and ruin, yet standing resolute at the heart of one of their small settlements. Recognizing the potential of such an asset, he quickly vanished back into the void, rejoining with the crusading fleet to inform them of the intact society upon Crisis. Furthermore, he believed that if this world had survived, that there must be more which were able to endure the chaos of the Age of Strife, and that they would surely be amicable to pledging themselves to the crusading fleet. Thus, with his reporting, the various factions within the Imperium were sparked into a great scramble for the feudal worlds of the galaxy, with commanders, generals, and tech priests alike altering their warpaths, simply in the hopes of uncovering one of these long-forgotten relics of humanity. As more of the worlds were discovered, their potential value to the Imperium rapidly began to grow. Not only did they still possess the titanic knights, but the resources of the world were often left untapped, partly due to the fact that their societies had regressed down to a more primitive way of life, based around a culture of farming and animal husbandry. But, amazingly, even though their kind had now grown to shun most technologies, it did not mean that they had destroyed the fabled relics from their first colonial exploits. Rare treasures from the dark age of technology still remained locked away in secure vaults, and upon certain worlds it was not unheard of to find the damaged, yet still salvageable fragments of an STC database. Because of this, the Mechanicus were spurred into a frenzied rush to assert their dominion over the feudal worlds. Yet, in their hubris, they would often neglect the political shrewdness of the nobles, who, as we must remember, had spent the past several millennia in an insular state, completely devoted to safeguarding their own populations. Thus, they could easily discern that behind honeyed words were often dark oaths of servitude, which would only benefit their new masters at the detriment of the feudals themselves. Yet, total defiance would provide only a guarantee of death and conquest at the hands of the crusading fleet, and so each knightly world carefully weighed out their options and chose to either pledge themselves to the young Imperium or to the technophants of the Mechanicum. At this point in galactic history, there were hundreds of feudal worlds which had endured the long night, and which were now being plucked out of isolation by the vying factions of mankind. The tech priests of the Mechanicum, however, were far more invested in establishing new bonds with the knightly households than of the Imperium, but this was almost certainly due to the potential technological bounty which they would inevitably reap from such an arrangement. As chance would have it, many of the feudal worlds were situated rather closely to the forge worlds of the Mechanicum, meaning that the priests would rapidly set about their plans of sending emissaries and gifts to woo the knightly houses. The early arrangements would typically involve the knights pledging their military might to the Mechanicum, who would repay their favor by repairing and restoring the often crumbling knights to their old state of glory. The artisanal class of builders had done their best to preserve the titanic walkers against the rigors of time, but they could not possibly hope to compare to the seemingly preternatural skill set of the tech priests, who treated each knight as the true masterpiece of engineering that it was. Old panels of armor, rusted and ruined, were replaced with pristine sheets of highly durable alloys, whereas makeshift weapons and rudimentary power systems were upgraded with the finest tools at the Mechanicum's disposal. Furthermore, the priests willingly shared their secrets with the craftsmen of these worlds, ensuring that they would ever be able to repair and upgrade their knights at their own discretion. Some of the knightly worlds, however, could not abide by the pervasive reach of the tech priests, who were keen on worming their mechadendrite feeders into every secretive aspect of their feudal societies. Thus, they eschewed the support of the Martian cult, choosing instead to throw in their loyalty with the growing armies of the Emperor. The knightly worlds pledged to the Imperium were to be known as the Questor Imperialis, mirrored by the Questor Mechanicum, who, as the name suggests, were allied to the children of Mars. Nevertheless, though, as an interesting point, most of the imperial knightly houses, though sworn to terror, will still display the fabled cog of Mars upon their walkers, perhaps as a sign of respect, held for the artisans who originally crafted the means of their salvation. The Imperials could not possibly hope to provide the same aid to the feudal worlds as their Mechanicum allies, and so more conventional trade agreements were formed, with the expectation that the knights would walk with them into battle should their aid be required. With that said, the Imperials were always quick to rattle their sabers, parking their crusading fleets in low orbit around the feudal planets, just to remind the nobles that if they were to refuse, that they would be condemning their worlds to death. Comparatively, the Questor Mechanicum worlds were gaining far more from their deals with the Martians, with their knights being upgraded to a new state of pristine glory. Yet there was an unseen and insidious cost to these gifts. The class of artisans and craftsmen who had preserved the knights for untold generations, passing their knowledge down through their bloodlines as treasured secrets, were now seen as antiquated by the priests. They cared not for the ancient traditions nor for the mythic tales of their forefathers, and so they ordained for a mass upheaval to occur. The craftsmen were to be taken from the feudal worlds to undergo a process of re-education and indoctrination into the teachings of the cult Mechanicum. No one can be sure of what transpired upon the Forge worlds, yet the artisans who were taken were not to return as their same old selves. Rather, when they travelled back to their old homes, they were now to be known as the sacristans, and it was clear that they now only held an allegiance to the technophants of Mars. In time, this caste would separate itself out from the rest of knightly society, forming religious brotherhoods and sects made up of a twisted mix of mechanicum knowledge and ancient feudal law. The sacristans would then assert themselves as the dominant political force of the world, superseding the rules of the knightly households, which had at this point stood unopposed for generations. The nobles could not speak out, as the sacristans could simply refuse to maintain their knights, leaving the towering symbols of strength to languish in untended ruin. And so the ancient households were now put in quite a predicament, where their only route to survival would be to entirely bend the knee to the insidious Martian cult. This silent invasion was enacted upon every possible Questa Mechanicum world, until eventually every planet which had falsely trusted the priests was caught and strangled within the long shadow of Mars. Perhaps worse than this was the careless desecration of their worlds, performed by the Martians who wished to extract the natural wealth from their new serfs as quickly as possible. Entire fleets would shuttle themselves back and forth from the feudal worlds, tearing out immense swathes of the landscape with each visit, in the search of minerals, oils, and natural materials, all to be subsumed in the raging fires of their forge. The Questa Imperialis worlds, however, were left almost entirely independent, but it was challenging for their nobles to respect the imperial lords, given that they had often shamed themselves in their attempts at garnering favors from the households. It was common practice for the Imperials to send huge bribes or groups of blustering diplomats who served to do little more than waste the time of the nobles, who were now growing tired of the repeated attempts at fully integrating their ancient worlds into the growing Imperium. Of course, we would be remiss to not mention the fact that if these feudal worlds were to ever deny the Imperium of its desires, that the indomitable war machine of the Emperor would be sure to descend, to wipe them from both this world and from history itself. Some of the noble households, however, were more than happy enough to take this risk. There are tales of knightly worlds which rejected the coming emissaries of the Emperor, decrying him as but a man lost in his ambitions, and so did not recognize his supposed authority over the stars. Naturally, this incited the burning ire of the imperial armies, and yet the frontier of the Great Crusade was ever pushing outwards, and so quite often there was no time for these steadfast worlds to be bathed in the punitive fires of retribution. Tintaroth, for instance, chose to remain independent from the oncoming imperial wave, and as chance would have it, its star system was destined to be occluded from the galaxy by a colossal warp storm, meaning that its people have remained safe and loyal to themselves, even well into the 41st millennium. But at this point in our tale, as the Great Crusade was reaching its end, we will find that most of the knightly worlds of the galaxy had been absorbed into the twin empires of mankind, and yet very few were to be happy with their arrangements. The Martians had stolen their history, replacing ancient traditions with the practices of their own cult, whilst the nobles had been deposed from power in all but their namesake. The Imperials, meanwhile, were serving as a constant thorn in the side of their own worlds, and so, over the coming years, many of the knightly worlds would look for an opportunity to break free and to reclaim their independence by any means necessary. Despite all of the successes achieved during the Great Crusade, the young Imperium, newly founded and expanded to cover nearly the entire breadth of the galaxy, was destined to be torn asunder during the unimaginable chaos of the Horus Heresy. In brief, this was where Horus, war master to the Imperium, pledged his soul to the dark gods of chaos and brought 8 of his fellow Primarchs with their legions over to his nefarious side. Their ultimate goal was to depose the rule of the false emperor and to lead all of humanity into the service of the ruinous powers of the warp, with the ascended Marines standing at the head of their new empire. It was not only the Primarchs and their legions who fell to the call of the dark gods, as we also saw a huge swathe of the Imperial army and of the Mechanicum similarly pledging themselves to chaos. Now, this last point is incredibly important to our story, as we must remember that many of the Night Worlds had at this point in time devoted themselves entirely to the Mechanicum, either by choice or by the supplantation of their nobles by the cult-like sacristans of Mars. Most of the Imperial lords thought it impossible for the knights to be corrupted, since, as a part of their bonding rituals with their walkers, the pilots would be entirely indoctrinated at a synaptic level to prevent them from ever having thoughts which could be considered as seditious. This was originally designed as a safe measure to ensure that the noble families would always protect their colonies, yet now it seemed as though it could possibly prove to be the undoing of all the Imperium had strived to build. For you see, the forces of the Dark Mechanicum were true experts in the fields of profane tech sorcery and archaeotechnological manipulation, and so it was only a matter of time before they were able to break and reform the once trusted protocols of the Knights. In but one single horrifying instant, the heretical scrap code was disseminated to every knight upon the worlds sworn to the turncoat Mechanicum, forcing their pilots to writhe and contort beneath the weight of the Immaterium, crushing down upon their now fractured minds. From this, the first of the Chaos Knights were born, newly ascended with the ruinous powers of the warp and eternally pledged to serve their malign masters within the Dark Mechanicum. But interestingly, not all of the knights who fell to chaos were forced to do so under these methods. Some of the households upon the Quaestor Imperialis worlds had at this point grown utterly sick of the arrogant Imperials, constantly leering down from on high with ever more invasive requests for resources and influence over the rulership of their peoples. But now they had heard rumors of the War Master Horus, and they saw the arch-traitor as being perhaps their only route towards attaining true freedom from the Imperium. Thus, the most irate of nobles came together and staged their own rebellions, sparking nightly wars, where rival houses were pitched against one another for the ultimate ownership of their worlds. The forces of chaos would often intervene to aid in the treacherous movement, and if successful, they would be the shepherds to guide the knightly nobles towards the corrupted pastures of the dark gods. They would first carve out great runes in the facade of their knights, and from a malign ritual would the demons of the warp be called forth and permitted to infest the ancient walkers, forever imbuing the essence of chaos into their prized symbols of royalty. Interestingly, some of the knightly households willingly sided with the traitors purely out of a sense of honor. There were several cases of night worlds which were saved from destruction during the Great Crusade by the forces of the Space Marines, and to repay them for this salvation, the nobles swore that their world would ever follow the Marines should they require their aid. Thus, when these Astartes turned to the ways of chaos, the knights adhered to the prior terms of their pledge, and without folly, they gave themselves over to the warp, so as not to bring dishonor to their names. Some of the Chaos Knights favored a life of iconoclasm, where every virtue they once upheld was to be cast aside, replaced instead by their newfound goals of conquest, slaughter, and tyranny. Others, who were far more infernal, grew closer with the Dark Mechanicum, permitting the heretical technophants to replace aspects of their walkers with warp-forged armaments, allowing them to bring a new level of death to the innocence of the galaxy. Not all of the traitorous knights were joined by their entire household, and in fact there were some individuals who felt the howling call of the warp, and so chose to leave alone to carve out their own path of blood and misery throughout the stars. These would be the Dreadblades, crestfallen nobles who hold loyalties only to themselves and whose obsessions and whims will take them throughout the vast expanse of our galaxy to complete only the darkest of quests which can be found. But despite all the death and all the destruction, we must acknowledge that not every knight fell to the sway of chaos. Around half of the knightly worlds were destined to remain loyal to their Imperial and Mechanicus lords, much to the chagrin of their treacherous compatriots who mocked and taunted the foolish nobles for willingly remaining as shackled slaves to a dying master. Nevertheless, they had sworn ancient oaths to safeguard all of mankind against the horrors of the dark, and with the rise of Horus and his traitor legions, they were now more than prepared to send their knights to join with the desperate armies of the Imperium. Some of the Imperial knights were destined to stand tall as the centerpieces to loyalist armies, towering over all others as an indomitable linchpin towards their victory over the traitor legions, who lacked the means to properly counter such a magnificent foe. But for the Mechanicum Knights, it was far more common for them to be absorbed into the Titan legions, where they would be dwarfed by even the smallest of Titans, relegating them into serving as light scouts, intended to survey apocalyptic battlefields and to strike through vulnerable points in the enemy lines. I previously mentioned that some of the knightly worlds were successful in maintaining their independence from both the Imperium and from the Mechanicum during the Great Crusade. But as the flames of the Horus heresy engulfed the galaxy, they were to be given a new name as the Black Shields. They served only themselves and their own people, defending their ancient worlds from both Imperial and traitor forces who would sporadically descend in the hopes of conquering a new planet for their respective masters. Some of the Black Shield worlds would come together to form loose confederations with one another, with the intent on forging a new realm for their chosen households. As one such example, let us look to the Sons of Conor, which was made up of several Black Shields within the eastern fringe of Ultramar, and who had pledged themselves to the service of a Baron, known only as the Crownless King. They were known to intervene upon Imperial Night Worlds to defend them from chaos invasions, but once victory was secured, they would turn their guns upon the Loyalists, demanding that they join the growing empire as a vassal beneath the new king. Throughout the course of the Horus heresy, the ancient bloodlines of the knightly households were pitched against one another, and through the chaos of war, many were wiped out, with their fabled lineages to be forever lost to time. But such is the cost of war, and perhaps this loss was worth it, for in the end, it was the Loyalists who seized the day. And with the death of Horus at the hands of the Emperor, the chaotic rebellion was finally put to its bloody end. In the wake of the failed heresy, the Chaos Knights were driven from the wounded Imperium, being chased into the nightmare of the Eye of Terror during a period now known as the Great Scouring. The turncoat nobles were forced to follow the directives of their masters within the Dark Mechanicum, who had found new purchase within the Warp, claiming demon worlds and hellforges to act as their staging grounds for future invasions into real space. Those Chaos Knights were destined to only grow more corrupted and perverted from their once glorious state. Their armor will be twisted, with horns and demonic limbs projecting out from warped frames, containing a pilot who was almost entirely dissolved into a mass of demonic flesh, their minds now trapped in an endless cacophony of malice and woe. Where once sat nobility and honor has now been replaced by a beast of deranged madness, utterly obsessed with their own twisted notions of death and destruction. But outside of the Eye of Terror, the surviving Loyalist houses were spared from the great purge of the Imperial armies, who were set to scour the stars of any corrupted elements which still remained as a poignant threat to the safety of the Imperium. But though they performed admirably and honourably during the heresy, many of the knightly households have since taken upon them a great burden of shame. Their nobles feel as though they have failed the Imperium, and by extension all of mankind, and so they have set out on redemptive quests intended to absolve their names from the sins of their past. Nevertheless, both the Quaestor Mechanicus and Quaestor Imperialis worlds have remained as mighty bastions to humanity ever since their first founding during the ancient days of the Dark Age of technology. As more time passes, we will only hear of more great and noble deeds to have been performed by the Loyalists, and ever more depraved and accursed feats of misery to be inflicted upon the stars by the treacherous nobles of the Chaos Knights. But in any case, with this, I do believe that we have come to our end. To my dearest friends, I thank you all for listening to this tale on the fall of the Imperial Knights in its entirety, but I must once again close this chapter, and so as I leave, I will wish you all with a very warm goodbye.